Welcome back, guys. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about Michelangelo's work, both as a sculptor and as a painter. I'm actually going to have you take a quick tour of the Sistine Chapel once you finish watching this series of notes and completing your work for the day. Your learning check is actually going to be about what you think of your tour of the Sistine Chapel. So let's talk about another great Renaissance artist, and that would be the exquisite Leonardo da Vinci. So you should all know this painting. If you haven't seen it, then I don't know what to tell you guys. This is, of course, the Mona Lisa. That's what we refer to the sitter as, although that's definitely not her name. This is a work of portraiture. It's a good example of kind of Renaissance portraiture. Um, it's actually very strange that this has become the painting that we all know Da Vinci for. But part of that is because there are so few paintings that we absolutely know that Da Vinci did. We know that Da Vinci did this painting because he never actually gave it to the guy who paid for it. He kept it with him for the entirety of his life and died with it. It is a small painting. If you ever go to the Louvre in Paris, it is a tiny little panel painting. It's done on wood, not canvas. So if you ever see a movie where someone like steals the Mona Lisa and then they roll it up and shove it in their book bag, that's a lie. It's made of wood. But it's oil on wood, and you can tell it's oil by kind of the luminosity of her skin here. See how she kind of glows? That's an example of the technique of oil painting. Additionally, there's a number of other things that are really characteristic of of Renaissance art during this time. One thing is that we can see a triangular shape emerge with her body here. This is terrible because, I'm working off of a terrible mouse here. But broadly, her body creates a triangular shape. That's deliberate. What artists tend to find is that triangles keep your eyes moving. You follow the light around, you follow the shape around. And so triangles give paintings visual interest. One other thing that you'll notice is that she seems to kind of glow from the painting. That's a chiaroscuro effect. See how bright the skin tone is here, and then how dark it is under her chin, and how the cloth kind of melts away on her dress. Ooh, that's all terrifying now. That is all an example of what happens when you've got chiaroscuro. The other thing that I will point out is the fact that the perspective's all wonky. Because look, in the background, you can see that there's water right here, yeah? And the horizon line on this side of her body appears to be about there. That appears to be kind of the level of the water. But if you look over on this side of her body, the horizon line is up here. And that's super weird because, like, Da Vinci knows what he's doing. He's not an amateur. This is art that is very deliberately done. So it doesn't seem like he would make that goof just mistakenly. So he might have been kind of playing around with us. We also know that this background that we see here, it doesn't exist in real life. It's entirely made up. Everybody also points out the fact that she doesn't have eyebrows. Whoop. But we actually know that she initially did. Whoops, that's terrifying. She did have eyebrows when she was initially painted. She just, unfortunately, someone at some point did a terrible job of cleaning the painting and cleaned so like viciously that they took the paint off. We can actually tell if we expose this to UV light and to black light. We can actually see the trace amounts of her eyebrows. The problem is that we don't want to go back and repaint them because like there aren't that many Da Vinci's in the world and no one wants to take responsibility for screwing it up. So another work of Da Vinci's that we absolutely know about is this one. This is a really, really famous Da Vinci work, and you might have seen it before. This right here is called The Last Supper. It is the depiction of Jesus's last meal with his disciples. This is right after Jesus has dropped the bomb of "one of you will betray me," and all of his guys are like, "No, not me," and then they're all like talking amongst each other. But what's really cool about this painting, which is a fresco painted on the wall of a convent in Italy. First of all, you'll notice it's in terrible shape. See all the paint that's flaking off? Frescoes shouldn't do that. That's because Da Vinci hated painting frescoes. And so he decided he was just going to create a new paint that would stick to dry plaster far better than fresco. And so he experimented with a number of different binders in terms of the pigment. And they didn't work. The painting started flaking off almost immediately. You can even tell that people kind of gave it up as lost because, see, you can see here, this is a doorway. That doorway was created in the 1700s. Somebody busted through the wall and put a doorway right through a Da Vinci because it was in such poor shape. They were like, not a great loss. You used to be able to see Jesus's feet underneath the table, but now obviously you cannot. Most art historians will tell you that if you want to see the Last Supper in person, you need to go in the next 40 years. There's not a lot we can do in terms of saving it. It is what it is, and it will decay off the wall. But there are things that we can point out here that are really important. One of the reasons that we like looking at the Last Supper is because it is using almost perfect, and excuse the terrible drawings here, almost perfect linear perspective. If you look at all the windows and the panels on the wall here, and you draw an imaginary line out, they intersect right at Christ's face. All of the lines in the whole painting do the same thing. They go this way. That's terrible. But that's deliberate. What it does, first of all, is it gives you the illusion of depth. And number two, it draws your attention to the central figure. The other thing that is really interesting about Da Vinci's painting here of the Last Supper is that, first of all, Last Suppers were a very common depiction in Catholic art. It was not uncommon to see a lot of depictions of the Last Supper, frankly, not just in Catholic art, in all Christian art. But generally speaking, what would happen is you would have Jesus and the disciples on one side of the table, and then you'd put Judas on the other side as kind of an indicator to the audience that, like, Judas is the betrayer here. But what Da Vinci has chosen to do is he's put everybody on the same side as Jesus, and the audience is on the side of the betrayer. So, like, it's Jesus has said, one of you will betray me. And then Da Vinci has put us in the position, potentially, if you're familiar with kind of like art at this time, he's put us in the position as the audience, as the role of the betrayer. And so he's asking the audience to think about their role in terms of like faith, which is a really interesting way to do this painting. So there you go. That's the Last Supper. Now, one of the most important things that Da Vinci is actually best known for is not any finished work, but rather his private notebooks. And for me, this is actually where Da Vinci shines. Da Vinci wasn't just an artist. Da Vinci was an inventor and an engineer and a scientist. He was an athlete. He was interested in military strategy. And he was unquestionably a genius. His notebooks are full of these sorts of illustrations of machinery for warfare. He even developed early forms of powered flight. This right here was kind of like an early draft of the helicopter. It would not have worked. It wouldn't have created enough uplift, but it is remarkable that you have someone in the 15th century dreaming of powered flight. You have these incredible detailed anatomical drawings of a fetus in the womb, which means that Da Vinci attended the autopsy of a woman who died prior to giving birth. And we can actually tell that this would have been quite a bit earlier than birth because the fetus has not yet rotated in the womb to be head down. That's normally the birthing position. So that tells you a fair bit about his medical interests as well. What's fascinating to me about this is all of these drawings and notations in his diaries. They're written in his own private code, so that they couldn't be understood by anyone but him, and they're written backwards. You have to hold it up to a mirror in order to be able to read it. And he was the sort of genius who could just do that without thinking about it. So when we talk about people being a Renaissance man, we mean that they are able to do a variety of different things and do them well. Leonardo da Vinci was an incredible Renaissance man. So the last major piece here that I want to talk about is called The School of Athens by Raphael. And this again is another really good example of linear perspective. If you look at the lines in the background, you will find that they all draw your attention right here, right to these two central figures. And those two central figures are meant to be Socrates and Plato. Or no, Socrates and Aristotle, my apologies. And you've got Diogenes, the critic here. This is Michelangelo. You've got, where's Hypatia? I think Hypatia is, she usually has a funny hat on. She's either this person or she's over here and I can't remember. Oh, here she is. Here she is. This is Hypatia. Whop. And right there, hiding right next to Hypatia, is the artist himself. Raphael has painted himself into this collection of great minds, essentially, all of the great Western thinkers. He's painted himself in. He's photobombed his own painting. So this is a really kind of good example of the influence of Greek and Roman philosophy on Renaissance art and how it all gets blended together. So that's Renaissance art in Italy, but I do want to talk briefly about the Northern Renaissance. I'm not going to get into this a whole lot. I know that these lectures are going to go a little bit long today, but I promise tomorrow's work will be nothing but fun, okay? So here we go. The Northern Renaissance. So the Northern Renaissance basically takes the ideas from the Italian Renaissance and moves them up into Northern Western Europe. And that means that it's going to happen a little bit later than the Renaissance happening in Italy. So the Italian Renaissance begins in the 14th century. The Renaissance, as it spreads into the Holy Roman Empire, into France, doesn't really happen until the 15th and 16th centuries. And it usually involves the Germanic states, the Holy Roman Empire. I'm going to abbreviate that as HRE because I don't like having to write it out every time. It's going to move into France and England and into the Dutch regions, the Netherlands, the Low Countries. And what we see is that as trade increases after the plague, you're going to have ideas spread, especially with the presence of the printing press. And so this means that the Italian ideas about humanism and secularism and individualism, they don't just stay in Italy, they spread. So they spread north as well. Now, one thing I will point out about the Northern Renaissance is that it occurred at the exact same time as a major religious movement that we're going to be talking about on Wednesday, and that is the Protestant Reformation. So the Northern Renaissance happened at the same time as the Protestant Reformation, and therefore the concerns of the Northern Renaissance are going to be distinctly different from what they are in Italy. So what we're going to tend to see here is that the artistic expression in the Northern Renaissance will be very different from the Italian Renaissance, because number one, they're going to rely on different forms of art. They're going to use a lot of woodcuts and printmaking. The printing press is developed in the Holy Roman Empire, and so the use of it in artistic production is going to be used way more in the North than it ever will be in the Italian city-states. Northern Renaissance art also tends to have a lot of tiny, realistic details. They're hyper-realistic paintings. There's a lot of symbolism that goes into them. And generally speaking, Northern Renaissance art uses a lot of oil paints, not acrylic, not fresco work. Part of that has to do with the fact that it's too cold and a bit too damp far up north. The frescoes won't dry properly. And acrylic just kind of looks flat. Whereas oil paints have a luminosity that the northern artists tended to appreciate a lot. Generally speaking, people in the north didn't do a whole lot of sculpture. Part of that's down to the fact that Northern Europe doesn't have a lot of availability of marble. They've got a fair bit of granite, but granite is way harder to carve than marble. And frankly, nobody's going to carve like statues out of granite until they have modern technologies. Instead, they're going to do some small-scale sculpture, mostly in wood, but what they are mostly interested in is painting, and their paint really leans into the use of chiaroscuro, really trying to emphasize light versus dark. So I'm going to stop here because I want to take a moment and talk extensively about this painting, but I'll stop for the moment here.